Welcome students to Lesson 3 of Changing Economic World. In this lesson we will be discussing how we measure development, which will help us to identify how exactly we can know how developed a country is. Please take a moment as ever to write down the date, title and learning objective. Okay, you see before you 3 paragraphs and 12 gaps. Please write the numbers 1 to 12, attempt to fill in the gaps, pause the video, and when you have attempted all the questions, then check your answers. Okay, let's do this. I'm going to read through, correct your answers, or tick them off as you go. Development is a long-term improvement in people's lives. There are differences in levels of development around the world. This is called the development gap. A developed country has a higher GDP per capita than a less developed country. GDP per capita is an economic measure of development because it is about money. A social measure of development is life expectancy, which indicates how healthy people are in a country, but also shows how peaceful it is. Another social measure is the literacy rate. This tells us how educated people are, which is important because education gives people the skills to gain high-paid or high-income jobs. The pattern of GDP per capita around the world indicates that most HICs are in the northern hemisphere. It also shows that the continent with the highest percent of LICs is Africa. Literacy rate has a similar pattern, with North America and Europe having the highest rates, and Africa having, on average, the lowest literacy rate. Japan has the highest life expectancy in Asia. The country with the highest life expectancy in South America is Chile. Okay, as ever, give yourselves a mark. If you got any of them wrong or you didn't perform as successfully as you'd like, then write out the sentence with the gap, put it on a flashcard, test yourself repeatedly. Okay, game time. Time for a recap. Depending on how long it's been since you last followed one of these lessons, regardless, it's still important for you to recall your knowledge so that you can link what you learned today to prior knowledge. With that in mind, this important question: what is the development gap? Here is a map showing GDP per capita patterns around the world. Here's a map showing literacy rate patterns around the world. And finally, here's a map showing life expectancy patterns around the world. Take a moment, pause the video, to write down one fact about each map, about the pattern of the countries around the world based on their measures of development. Okay, let's discuss what you might have written. So for GDP per capita, you may have written that the highest GDP per capita is in North America, Europe, and Oceania, Australasia. You may have written that Africa has on average low GDP per capita. South America, here, is somewhere in the middle. Asia has a very big mix of GDP per capita, from highs, for example Japan and United Arab Emirates, to lows, for example Afghanistan or Nepal. For literacy rate, a similar pattern. You may have written that North America has a high literacy rate and Asia as well, but with lower areas like Afghanistan. Oceania has generally a high literacy rate, South America somewhere in the middle, and again Africa comes out the worst. Life expectancy, similarly, you may have seen that life expectancy, you may have written that life expectancy is highest in North America, Europe and Oceania. It's also high in countries like Japan and South Korea, and in South America it's high in Chile. Importantly, you may have written that life expectancy is lowest on average in Africa. If you missed any of these points or you wrote anything else, then please take a moment to think about that so that you consolidate it in your mind, so that you remember it. Okay, today's key idea. This is really important. Hold on to this. If we measure development, the measures that we use need to accurately tell us how good life is in a country for the people living there. If it doesn't, it is not a good measure of development. Much as we measure height with centimeters or feet, or weight with kilos or tons or grams, a measure of development needs to be accurate. So, have a look at these pictures and I'll introduce you to this idea. Here's a picture of a gentleman with a car in Saudi Arabia. Here's my question for you. Describe what you see in the picture. And just from this picture, don't use any of your own knowledge, just from this picture, describe in a sentence how developed Saudi Arabia is. pause the video and write down any thoughts you have. Okay. Now look at this picture. Now write down how developed you think Saudi Arabia is. Now look at this third question. If I use GDP per capita to measure Saudi Arabia's development, I would get the figure of more than $50,000 per year, which would make Saudi Arabia one of the richest countries in the world and one of the most developed countries in the world. But from these pictures, do you think and do you agree that Saudi Arabia is a very, very developed country for everyone? Does everyone live well in Saudi Arabia? You may have answered to that question no, because although this gentleman here looks very rich with his Lamborghini, these people certainly do not. They're selling fish on the street, from their clothes, from the wall behind them. You may be able to tell these people are significantly poorer than this man, but they live in the same country. There's a word for this, and the word is inequality. Some people in Saudi Arabia are much richer than other people. We call this inequality, the difference in the amount that people have in a country. And GDP per capita, importantly, does not show inequality. It doesn't show who is rich and who is poor. It is just one number. And as a result, you have no idea who actually has the money in a country if you just use GDP per capita. So, today I'm going to really help you understand why using a single measure of development, like GDP per capita, has its disadvantages and how we could do better. So, get ready to rumble. Here we go. I would encourage you all at this point to write this subtitle. What is the problem with a single measure of development? Okay, I'm going to introduce you to a country you may or may not have heard of. This is a photo of this country. This is another photo of this country, and here it is on the map. It's called Equatorial Guinea, and it's in West or Sub-Saharan Africa, right here. Very small country. Now this is important. Equatorial Guinea makes most of its money from selling oil to other countries around the world. Oil which is used in cars, in planes, in ships, as fuel. Gives them energy so that you can use it for transport. Equatorial Guinea makes a lot of money from this. In fact, if you measure the GDP per capita of Equatorial Guinea, it makes Equatorial Guinea look like an HIC. The GDP per capita is very high. That's because a lot of the money from oil comes into the country, and some people get very rich. As a result, some places in Equatorial Guinea look like this. Clean roads, modern houses, street lights, good, well-constructed buildings. Everything looks calm, peaceful, and rich. However, other places in Equatorial Guinea look like this. Clearly much poorer. The houses of poor quality with tin roofs and wooden structures. The mud, dirt roads rather than concrete paved or tiled roads. No street lights. Possibly a lack of electricity or toilets. Life is very different here. If you remember, we call this inequality. And GDP per capita would tell you that Equatorial Guinea is an HIC. But it wouldn't tell you that there is inequality in Equatorial Guinea. So the first problem with a single measure of development, like GDP per capita, is that it doesn't show inequality, the difference between people in the same country. Here's another problem. This is another picture of Equatorial Guinea. This is the capital city of Equatorial Guinea called Malabo. Now in Malabo, you see, when you walk down the streets, many people doing this kind of thing. First of all, there are lots of young people, and they are selling things like this on the street side. Vegetables, fruit, other things like that. This is really important because these people do not have bank accounts. When they make money, they get their money in cash and in coins, and they don't put it into a bank account. So there's no record of the amount of money they made. Also, they don't pay any taxes to the government, which means, again, there is no record of the amount of money they made. We call jobs in which there is no record of the money being made, we call them a part of the informal economy. That is, the jobs in a country that are not recorded, that are not protected, and that the government doesn't know about. This is important because GDP per capita, when we work out the GDP per capita of a country, we do not include jobs in the informal economy. And in a country like Equatorial Guinea, there are lots of jobs in the informal economy. It means that the people who are in the informal economy, who tend to be very poor, are not included in that measure. As a result, the GDP per capita is very often higher than it should be, because these poor people in the informal economy are not included. If the low number from these people in the informal economy was included, the GDP per capita would fall, and so you would think the country was poorer. So second reason why a single measure of development like GDP per capita is not good enough is because it doesn't include jobs in the informal economy. It is, as a result, inaccurate. So, we've got GDP per capita, a single measure of development, doesn't show inequality, the difference between people, and it doesn't show all the jobs and all the people in the country, like the people in the informal economy. To give you another example of Equatorial Guinea, life expectancy is problematic as well. Very often when people die in Equatorial Guinea, there's no record of it. There's no official record. More importantly, when people are born, there often isn't a record either, which means we don't know exactly how old people are very often. And as a result, we don't know how old they were when they die. And that means that our measure of life expectancy in Equatorial Guinea is likely to be inaccurate. It could be higher, it could be lower, but it is most likely higher, which means that we might think that Equatorial Guinea is again more developed, that people are healthier than in fact they are. So, if a single measure of development isn't a good way of working out how developed a country is, what is better? And here I'm going to introduce you to a powerful idea. That idea is called the Human Development Index. Yep, it's a mouthful, but just call it from now on the HDI. Write this down as a subtitle, pause the video and make that happen. Okay. Here's a map of the world based on the Human Development Index, and here's what it shows. It's based on three things. The Human Development Index is three measures of development added together. It shows the literacy rate, the life expectancy, and finally the GDP per capita. And it adds all of those three measures up and it gives you an overall score out of 1. So 1 is the perfect score and 0 is the worst possible score. And every country is between 1 or 0. The most developed country in the world is very close to 1, and the least developed country in the world is close to 0. So for example, the most developed country in the world according to the Human Development Index is Norway. And Norway is located here. The least developed country in the world, according to the Human Development Index, is Mali. Here, it's got a number much closer to 0. This measure of development is much better because if a country has a high GDP per capita but a low life expectancy, then its score on the HDI will be lower. If a country, however, has a lower GDP per capita, the people are poorer, but they're very healthy, so the life expectancy is high, and they're very educated, so the literacy rate is high, then the measure will be higher. Why is this a good measure of development? Why is this better? Simply because development is more than just money. People, as I'm going to show you, can live in developed countries without making a lot of money. On the converse, people can make a lot of money in a country, but their quality of life can be worse. They might not live as long as people who make just as much money in other countries. For example, if we just use money, we would think that the United States of America is just as developed as Norway. But in fact, because they have the same GDP per capita, or very similar, but in fact, Norway has a higher life expectancy and a higher literacy rate than the United States of America. As a result, the HDI score in Norway is higher than the HDI score in the USA, because development is more than just money. Here's the pattern for GDP per capita. Look at some important differences. If you just look at GDP per capita, you get this interesting pattern. Europe here. There are some differences in Europe between European countries. For example, Spain and Portugal and Italy are lower on GDP per capita than Norway and Ireland, for example. But on the HDI score, they're higher. Why? Because they have really good high life expectancy and literacy rate. Italy is particularly good for life expectancy and literacy rate. So even though the people are poorer than in Norway, its score is almost as high as Norway's because of the education and health of the people. Similarly, according to GDP per capita, Chile is similar to Argentina and to Brazil. However, according to the Human Development Index, Chile and Argentina are much better than Brazil because people in Chile and Argentina live longer and are generally more educated. So let me give you 3 powerful examples to show you this. Number 1, Costa Rica is a country located right here. Now, Costa Rica is, according to GDP per capita, the 78th most developed country in the world. But according to HDI, it's the 68th. Why? Because the people are very healthy, has high life expectancy, and they're very educated. As a result, its score goes up by 10. Second example. Germany. According to GDP per capita, Germany is the 27th most developed country in the world. Germany here. But according to the Human Development Index, it's 4th in the world because its healthcare and its education is one of the best in the world. People live longer than anywhere else, and they are more educated than almost anywhere else. As a result, Germany's HDI score is much higher than its GDP per capita score. Final example to really bring this point home. Saudi Arabia. According to GDP per capita alone, it is the 22nd most developed country in the world. But the healthcare and the education in Saudi Arabia are nowhere near as good. As a result, its HDI score drops to 36th in the world. This all brings home and should help you understand the point, this simple point. Development is more than money. It's about health and education as well. Okay, knowledge check. See if you've understood this. Please write 1 to 8. Answer the questions as well as you can, and then pause the video, and then check your answers. Okay, let's go through the answers. Number 1, 2 social measures of development. You could have had any of the following. Literacy rate, life expectancy, infant mortality, that's the number of babies that die before their 5th birthday per 1,000 who are born, the birth rate or the death rate. You could have also had doctors per 1,000 people. Number 2, a social measure of development looks at quality of life, not standard of living. Number 3, GDP per capita is an economic measure of development, again, about money. Number 4, GDP per capita shows us the average income of people in a country, not the differences between people. Number 5, any single measure of development does not show inequality, the differences between what people have in a country, for example, money. Number 6, the Human Development Index combines life expectancy, literacy rate, and GDP per capita to give a much more accurate picture of a country's development. Number 7, Costa Rica in North America has a high literacy rate and life expectancy, and so it has a higher HDI rank than GDP per capita rank. Number 8, Saudi Arabia has high inequality in access to healthcare and education, so its HDI rank is lower than its GDP per capita rank. Okay, as you can see, there's more than one answer for each question, for certain questions, so let's work out our score. Please give yourselves a score out of 11. Again, as ever, if you didn't score particularly well or there were some questions you missed, write the question on the front of a flashcard, write the answer on the back, test yourself repeatedly, or come back to this video in a week's time and test yourself on this quiz again. Okay. The key principle of learning. If you want to remember something, and if you want to prove to yourself that you have learned something, you need to be able to explain it in your own words. 2 questions. I'd like you to answer these in your books or on paper. Write the question as a title, and take your time to answer it. And when you feel you've given a good answer to both these questions, then reveal the answers on the PowerPoint and mark your work. Okay, here are the questions. Make sure that you use these keywords in your answers. Okay, let's go through the answers. So first question, name and explain. So name one measure of development and explain one disadvantage of it. So you could have had the following. GDP per capita. One disadvantage, it's an average and therefore it doesn't show inequality. You could have said life expectancy or any other social measure. It's difficult to collect data in poor or violent countries and therefore it's inaccurate. For example, as I said, life expectancy, it's often not recorded when people are born in poorer countries. So the measure is inaccurate. All single measures might be out of date, similarly. If there's a war in a country, for example in Syria recently, it's difficult to measure the different indicators of development as that's going on. And so the measures that you do have will become out of date very quickly. Second question. Why is the Human Development Index, HDI, better than any single measure? And you needed to use these keywords. So you could have included the following ideas. Development is about more than just a higher income. It's about health, happiness, and education. The HDI shows these features of development, and so it gives a better understanding of how good people's lives are. So 2 marks if you got that point. You could have also said, and this is really important, whenever there's an explain question, you should also always give an example to prove your understanding. For example, a country with high inequality of healthcare and education, for example Saudi Arabia, may have higher GDP per capita than HDI. But a country with good education and healthcare for everyone, for example Germany or Costa Rica, they may have a better HDI than GDP per capita. So, give yourselves a mark out of 6 to evaluate your current understanding. Again, if you've underperformed in any of these, watch the explanation part of this video again, and test yourself on it in a week's time. Finally, let's review. From memory this time, without looking back at any of your notes, in your book or on your paper, try and answer this question. 2 reasons why life expectancy increases as a country develops. See if you can relate it to these keywords. Pause the video, try and answer it, and then check your answer. Final, concluding point. Let's see how you've done. You should have said, as a country develops, healthcare improves, so illnesses are treated more effectively, a mark. Or as income increases, people's diet improves because they can afford better food, so they're healthier, a mark. Or you could have said, more developed countries are more peaceful, so there's less chance of death in conflict or violence or in violent crime, a mark. If you got any of these 2 points and explained them correctly, you get 2 marks. Thank you so much again for joining me for this lesson on economic development. Next lesson, we will be really unpacking the meaning of 3 important terms in economic development. They are HIC, NEE, and LIC. Please join me for that lesson, and thank you very much for working so hard. You're going to make excellent progress if you continue.